It is January 1623. In Colchester, England, anticipation fills the air as the world's attention turns to two women whose strength has echoed through time. Margaret Cavendish of England and Sibylla Merian of Germany. Each carved her legacy across continents, navigating politics, tragedy, and power in a world ruled by men. Let us begin with the first, Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle upon Tyne. Margaret Cavendish was born in the year 1623 in Colchester, Essex, England. Her exact day and month of birth are unknown, but her roots were firmly tied to a family of influence. She was the youngest child of Sir Thomas Lucas, a landowner who once faced exile after a duel, and Elizabeth Leighton, who worked to raise 8 children with dignity after her husband's death. What shaped this youngest daughter of a royalist household? How did she rise from the quiet halls of Colchester to the courts of France, and then into the turbulent world of philosophy and literature? Why would her writings, dismissed by some in her lifetime, later be seen as groundbreaking and visionary? The answers lie in the journey of a woman whose courage to write set her apart from her age. Please watch my full video until the end, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now, let us dive into the full story. From the very beginning, Margaret's family carried both privilege and struggle. Her brothers fought as staunch royalists in the English civil wars, and her sisters shared a reputation for strength and loyalty. Within this household, young Margaret learned resilience, faith, and independence, even though she lacked a formal education. Instead, she found her path through books, private tutors, and her own restless imagination, early sparks of the creativity that would later define her extraordinary life. Margaret Cavendish spent her early years in Colchester, a town in Essex known for its deep ties to English history. As the youngest of 8 children in the Lucas family, she grew up surrounded by strong personalities who would leave their mark on her life. Her father, Sir Thomas Lucas, had already passed away by the time she was 2 years old, leaving her widowed mother, Elizabeth Leighton, to raise the large family largely on her own. Despite these challenges, her mother worked tirelessly to maintain the family's wealth and respectability. Margaret later remembered that her mother kept their household in a condition not much lower than when her father was alive. The Lucas family was fiercely loyal to the crown. Margaret's brothers, Sir John, Sir Thomas, and Sir Charles, became known as royalist supporters during the English civil wars. Their courage and political involvement created an atmosphere of loyalty, honor, and resistance within the home. For young Margaret, these examples set the foundation of her own loyalty and resilience. Though she received little formal schooling, Margaret had access to books, tutors, and the company of educated relatives. Still, she admitted that as a child she was shy, often retreating into her own imagination. She spent hours writing down ideas, though she rarely shared them, fearing criticism in a society where women were discouraged from intellectual pursuits. These formative years in Colchester laid the groundwork for her creativity and independence. Even without structured education, Margaret's early exposure to reading and her family's political convictions shaped her into a woman ready to challenge the boundaries of her time. Margaret Cavendish grew up in a household where formal education for girls was rare, yet she still found ways to nurture her mind. She later admitted that she did not attend school like her brothers, but her family's standing provided her with access to private tutors and well-stocked libraries. Even so, she observed that tutors often served more for formality than for benefit, as the children paid little heed to structured lessons. Rather than relying on classroom teaching, Margaret's education became self-driven, fueled by her natural curiosity and determination. From a young age, she began to record her ideas and reflections on paper. Writing, however, was not something expected or encouraged for women. Displaying too much intellect could be seen as improper, even dangerous, for a girl in 17th-century England. Because of this, Margaret kept her early writings mostly private, scribbling down her thoughts in secret. These early habits gave her the confidence to form her own views, even when they stood apart from traditional beliefs. The Lucas household itself was a vibrant place, full of political discussion, loyalty to the crown, and the arts of noble living. Margaret grew up surrounded by examples of bravery, loyalty, and conviction from her brothers, and perseverance from her mother. Within this environment, her imagination found fertile ground. Though she later admitted her phrasing and style were imperfect, Margaret's persistence with writing in her youth set the foundation for her future. What began as a quiet pastime would eventually transform into bold publications that challenged the conventions of her age. As a teenager, Margaret Cavendish entered a new world of responsibility and uncertainty when she became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Henrietta Maria, the French-born wife of King Charles I. This role brought her away from the familiar safety of Colchester and placed her directly into the heart of royal circles. It was both an honor and a challenge, for the court demanded grace, discipline, and constant watchfulness. Margaret was naturally shy, and she later admitted that her quietness often made others mistake her for a fool. Yet this silence came not from ignorance, but from anxiety about saying the wrong thing in such powerful company. She felt out of place without the guidance of her siblings and often worried about being judged harshly. Despite her unease, she endured the pressures of court life with patience and discretion, preferring to remain unnoticed rather than risk disgrace. When the English Civil War erupted, Margaret's service took her even farther from home. She followed Queen Henrietta Maria into exile in France, joining the royal household abroad. For the first time, she was separated from her family and forced to adapt to life in a foreign land, where she lived at the court of the young King Louis XIV. This period sharpened her awareness of politics, alliances, and survival. Though she sometimes regretted leaving home for this position, Margaret's years as a lady-in-waiting exposed her to the world of high society, diplomacy, and exile, experiences that later informed both her confidence and her writings. In the year 1645, Margaret Lucas's life changed forever when she married William Cavendish, the Marquess of Newcastle, who later became the Duke of Newcastle upon Tyne. At the time of their marriage, he was already a respected royalist commander and a man of significant wealth and influence. For Margaret, the union was not about status or fortune, but about genuine admiration. She later recalled that she loved him for his merit, justice, and fidelity, rather than his power or title. Their marriage, however, was quickly tested by the turbulence of the English Civil Wars. William Cavendish, having supported King Charles I, faced defeat and loss. In 1644, even before their marriage, he had gone into self-imposed exile in France after the royalist cause suffered crushing blows. Margaret joined him in exile, standing by his side despite the uncertainties of displacement and political defeat. The couple lived abroad for nearly 15 years, moving through France and the Low Countries. Life in exile was far from easy. They endured financial struggles, courtly politics, and the emotional weight of being cut off from their homeland. Yet these years also gave Margaret opportunities to engage with European thinkers and writers, encounters that would deeply influence her intellectual growth. Although separated from England, Margaret and William built a relationship of loyalty and mutual respect. She often credited her husband with supporting her literary ambitions, even defending her when others claimed that he, not she, was the true author of her works. Exile, while harsh, became the backdrop against which Margaret began to shape her identity as both a writer and a philosopher. During her years in exile in France, Margaret Cavendish found herself immersed in circles that stretched beyond politics into the realm of philosophy and science. The French court under the young King Louis XIV was vibrant, full of intellectual exchange, and Margaret's position as the wife of William Cavendish gave her access to people of influence. Though she remained shy, she listened closely and absorbed the debates shaping 17th-century thought. It was in this environment that she encountered some of the most significant thinkers of her time. She came into contact with philosophers such as René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and Henry Moore. While she was not formally educated in philosophy, these conversations and observations broadened her perspective. They challenged her to think critically about nature, science, and the human mind. Margaret was unusual among women of her age for her boldness in engaging with ideas that were typically reserved for men. She disagreed with many accepted views, often rejecting Aristotelian and mechanical philosophies in favor of her own vitalist approach, which emphasized the self-moving and rational qualities of matter. This independence of thought would later become central to her published works. Despite financial struggles and the uncertainty of exile, Margaret began to write with greater confidence. Surrounded by an intellectual atmosphere, she sharpened her arguments, honed her voice, and laid the foundation for the dozens of works she would later publish. These years in France became a turning point, transforming her from a quiet observer into a writer ready to challenge convention. In 1660, with the restoration of King Charles II to the throne, Margaret Cavendish and her husband finally returned to England after years of exile. What should have been a triumphant homecoming was quickly clouded by hardship. The Cavendish estates, once grand and prosperous, had been confiscated during the civil wars. Margaret learned that much of what belonged to her husband had been seized or sold off, and her hopes of securing income through petitions to Parliament were swiftly denied. For a brief time, she returned without William to try to reclaim property. She discovered the difficulty of navigating the legal system as a woman, and after only one failed attempt at petitioning, she decided the effort was not worth the humiliation or disappointment. In her own words, she felt it better to endure financial strain with dignity than to beg fruitlessly for favors. Margaret and William's struggles continued even after their reunion. Though William regained some measure of respect under the restored monarchy, their finances never returned to their earlier strength. They lived in reduced circumstances compared to the wealth they had once known, and Margaret often worried about their future. Yet within these struggles, she found purpose in her writing. Rather than sinking into despair, she turned her energy to philosophy, poetry, and plays, crafting works that gave her both identity and resilience. Financial instability may have limited her material wealth, but it strengthened her resolve to leave behind a different kind of fortune, a legacy of words, ideas, and intellectual courage. Margaret Cavendish often reflected on her own personality, describing herself as naturally bashful and prone to what she called melancholia. From an early age, she had struggled with shyness, especially in unfamiliar company. At court, her quiet nature led some to mistake her for simple-minded, though in truth her silence masked deep thought and anxiety about making mistakes in public. She preferred to observe rather than speak, a habit that often gave her an air of detachment, but also fueled her inner world of creativity. Her bashfulness, however, was not without cost. Margaret admitted that she sometimes regretted leaving home to serve Queen Henrietta Maria, believing her melancholic temperament made her unsuited for such a role. She even described the physical symptoms of her shyness, pale complexion, inability to speak at times, and nervous gestures. These struggles colored her self-image, yet she transformed them into themes in her writings, often satirizing her own timidity with wit and candor. In matters of health, she endured challenges as well. Despite medical efforts, Margaret was unable to bear children, a loss she felt deeply, especially in a society where heirs and family continuity were highly valued. This absence weighed on her but also left her with time to devote to writing, which she often described as her child and her legacy. Her faith, too, shaped her worldview, though in complex ways. While she believed in God's existence, she preferred to separate philosophy from theology, insisting that natural reason could not fully grasp the divine. To Margaret, even inanimate matter bore an innate awareness of God, a view that underscored her distinctive approach to science and religion. Margaret Cavendish was as deliberate in her public image as she was in her writings. She believed in the power of appearance, often using fashion as a way to stand apart. She disliked following the styles of other women, preferring unique clothing that made her instantly recognizable. To Margaret, her dress was not just a matter of taste, but a reflection of her independence and her refusal to conform to expectations. Her desire for fame was equally strong and unapologetic. She openly admitted that she hoped her works would outlast her lifetime, bringing her honor and recognition. Unlike many women of her age, who published anonymously or not at all, Margaret boldly placed her own name on her books and even included engraved portraits of herself on the covers. This practice was daring in a society where women's voices were often dismissed or silenced, but it gave her ownership of her identity as an author. Margaret also defended her ambition in her writing. She argued that there was no shame in seeking renown, so long as it was tied to virtue and creativity. She believed fame could be a noble goal, allowing her to prove that women were just as capable of intellectual achievement as men. At times, she compared her books to children, her true legacy, which she hoped would earn respect even if she herself faced criticism. Her combination of fashion and ambition made her a striking figure in 17th-century England. Margaret's bold self-presentation, paired with her hunger for recognition, ensured that she could not be easily ignored, whether by her admirers or her detractors. Margaret Cavendish's literary career began in earnest with the publication of Poems and Fancies in 1653. This collection contained poems, epistles, and prose pieces on subjects ranging from natural philosophy to love, war, and honor. In it, she dared to write about atoms, other worlds, and even conversations between abstract forces such as peace and war. For a woman of her time, it was a bold step into fields usually dominated by men. The book also revealed Margaret's playful imagination and her willingness to experiment with form. She often compared poetry to spinning, a task typically associated with women, but she redefined it as mental spinning, a way for her to weave new worlds with words. By framing her writing through such metaphors, she acknowledged gender expectations while quietly undermining them. Although she admitted her rhymes were sometimes clumsy, Margaret insisted that meaning mattered more than elegance. She wrote not to display literary polish, but to share ideas and challenge readers to think. She also included dedications and prefaces in which she defended her right to publish, reminding her audience that women, too, could contribute to philosophy and science. Poems and Fancies marked her entry into the public literary world and set the tone for her future works. Some critics mocked her efforts, while others admired her courage. Regardless of the reception, the book established her as a writer unafraid to put her name and face before the public. For Margaret, the collection was more than a pastime. It was a declaration that her voice belonged in the realm of ideas. Margaret Cavendish expanded her literary presence beyond poetry with works that revealed her private world and opinions. In 1656, she published A True Relation of My Birth, Breeding, and Life, an autobiographical account written as an addition to her book Nature's Pictures. Unlike most women of her time, who lived within carefully guarded roles, Margaret chose to present her own story directly to the public. She described her lineage, her upbringing, her marriage, and even her temperament. She admitted her bashfulness, her contemplative habits, and her longing for fame. By openly acknowledging her flaws and ambitions, she gave readers a rare glimpse into the personal life of a 17th-century woman writer. The autobiography also served a larger purpose. Margaret wanted to counter gossip and criticism by offering her own narrative rather than allowing others to define her. In doing so, she compared herself to figures like Caesar and Ovid, who also left behind personal accounts. It was a daring step that reinforced her belief in the importance of women's voices. Later, in 1664, she published CCXI Sociable Letters, a collection written as though composed by real women. These letters covered an astonishing variety of subjects: politics, science, literature, medicine, and even gambling. Some characters appeared to be based on real individuals, while others were entirely fictional. Through this form, Margaret created lively conversations that reflected the world around her, blending observation with imagination. Both her autobiography and her letters demonstrated her confidence in stepping beyond traditional boundaries. By inserting herself into the public conversation, she claimed authority not only as a thinker, but also as a woman determined to be heard. Margaret Cavendish was not content to be known only as a poet or letter writer. She pushed into fields rarely touched by women of her time: natural philosophy and science. From the 1650s onward, she published several works that questioned widely accepted ideas about nature and the universe. Among her most important contributions were philosophical letters and observations upon experimental philosophy, both published in the 1660s. In these writings, Margaret rejected the dominant Aristotelian and mechanical philosophies, which treated the world as a machine. Instead, she developed her own vitalist theory, arguing that all matter was self-moving, rational, and alive in its own way. Even inanimate things, she believed, carried an inner awareness of God and the natural order. This daring view placed her in opposition to many respected thinkers, but it also gave her a distinctive voice in scientific debates. She was influenced by conversations with Thomas Hobbes, whose materialist philosophy resonated with her, yet she remained determined to form her own interpretations. She insisted on writing in plain English rather than the technical language of scholars, hoping her works would be accessible to a wider audience. For Margaret, philosophy was not meant to intimidate, but to inspire thought. Her philosophical writings were bold, often criticized as eccentric or ill-informed, but they proved she was unafraid to engage in debates reserved for men. She became the first woman to attend a meeting of the Royal Society in 1667, where she openly discussed her ideas. Through her philosophical works, Margaret carved a place for herself as one of the earliest women to claim authority in the world of science. In 1666, Margaret Cavendish published one of her most extraordinary works, the description of a new world, called the Blazing World. It was later paired with her observations upon experimental philosophy, and stands today as one of the earliest examples of science fiction. At a time when women were expected to remain silent in intellectual matters, Margaret dared to create a fantastical universe ruled by a female empress, a world where imagination and philosophy merged. The story follows a young woman who travels through the North Pole into another realm, where she becomes the empress of a new world filled with strange, animal-like beings. Through this allegorical setting, Margaret explored questions of science, gender, power, and the limits of reason. In the book's epilogue, she even wrote herself into the story, naming herself Margaret I, as if to declare her independence and authority alongside kings and emperors. The Blazing World was more than entertainment. It was a bold critique of the male-dominated intellectual world. Margaret used fiction to question the balance between imagination and logic, science and philosophy, and men and women. While some dismissed the work as eccentric, others admired its originality and daring vision. Modern scholars now recognize The Blazing World as a groundbreaking step in the history of science fiction. Its blending of utopian thought, philosophy, and storytelling influenced later writers and secured Margaret Cavendish's reputation as both a pioneer and a visionary. With this work, she extended her legacy beyond her century, ensuring her voice would echo far into the future of literature. Margaret Cavendish's writings drew strong and often divided reactions during her lifetime and long after. To some, she was an eccentric noblewoman whose works lacked polish or discipline. Samuel Pepys, a member of the Royal Society, famously described her as mad and conceited, while others compared her boldness to folly. Dorothy Osborne once remarked that she belonged more in Bedlam than among serious thinkers. Such criticisms reflected not only doubts about her style, but also the discomfort many felt toward a woman stepping so openly into intellectual spaces reserved for men. Yet alongside the criticism came admiration. Poets such as John Dryden, philosophers like Walter Charlton, and courtiers including Constantine Huygens praised her originality. Her husband, William Cavendish, even compiled a collection of poems and letters written in her honor, showcasing the respect she commanded in certain circles. Over time, her defiance of social expectations inspired later generations who saw in her a forerunner of women's intellectual freedom. In the centuries that followed, her reputation shifted. By the 19th century, critics such as Charles Lamb admired her sociable letters, and by the 20th century, writers like Virginia Woolf highlighted her as a fascinating, if unconventional, personality in the common reader. More recently, scholars and feminists have celebrated her as a pioneer of women's writing and a founding figure in science fiction. Her influence now stretches across literature, philosophy, and gender studies. What once seemed eccentric is today seen as groundbreaking. Margaret Cavendish may have been ridiculed in her time, but her legacy endures as proof that daring to speak, even against the tide, can leave an indelible mark on history. In her final years, Margaret Cavendish continued to write, reflect, and cultivate her identity as both a thinker and a noblewoman. Though she never achieved the financial security she and William Cavendish had once enjoyed, she gained recognition as a striking intellectual presence. Her bold publications and eccentric style ensured she remained a subject of conversation, admired by some and mocked by others. Still, she valued the fame she had earned and considered her writings her true legacy. Margaret spent her later years in London, where she maintained her routines of study, writing, and attending to social life. Though childless, she poured her creative energy into her works, often likening them to her children. She continued to refine her philosophical ideas, defending the right of women to think and publish, even when critics dismissed her. Her life with William remained strong. He encouraged her ambitions and later took great care to preserve her memory. On the 16th of December in 1673, Margaret Cavendish passed away in London at the age of about 50. Her body was laid to rest on the 7th of January in 1674 at Westminster Abbey, a place reserved for figures of great distinction. Her husband commissioned a monument in her honor, carved by the sculptor Grinling Gibbons, which still stands in the north transept of the abbey. Her epitaph praised her noble family, her virtue, and the valor of her siblings. Yet her greatest legacy was her fearless pursuit of knowledge and authorship. Margaret Cavendish left the world not only with her writings, but also with the example of a woman who dared to defy the boundaries of her age. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Maria Sibylla Merian of Germany was born on the 2nd of April in the year 1647 in the city of Frankfurt, within the Holy Roman Empire. How did this curious girl, surrounded by paints, pigments, and the smell of fresh ink, grow into one of the most groundbreaking naturalists of her time? What unseen paths carried her from the careful brushstrokes of her youth to the dense jungles of South America? And how did her work challenge the way people viewed the natural world even centuries later? Maria Sibylla was born into a family that was deeply connected to the world of art and printing. Her father, Matthäus Merian the Elder, was a well-known publisher and engraver whose illustrated books were admired across Europe. Sadly, he died when Maria was only 3 years old, leaving her mother, Johanna Sibylla, a widow. Soon after, her mother remarried Jacob Marell, a still-life painter who specialized in flowers and fruit. This second marriage would prove important, for Marell introduced Maria to the artistic traditions of painting, drawing, and observing the natural world in fine detail. Growing up in Frankfurt, Maria was surrounded by an environment that valued creativity, precision, and the recording of knowledge. From a young age, she was drawn not only to painting blossoms and petals, but also to the caterpillars and butterflies that hovered among them. While other children saw insects as ordinary, Maria saw mystery and transformation. These early influences, her father's legacy in publishing and her stepfather's art studio, laid the foundation for a life that would bridge science and art in ways few had imagined. From an early age, Maria Sibylla Merian displayed a deep fascination with the smallest creatures of the natural world. While most children might have overlooked the crawling caterpillars or buzzing insects in the garden, Maria found herself captivated by their movements, colors, and hidden transformations. Living in Frankfurt, she had access to gardens and open spaces where flowers attracted a wide variety of insects, providing her with endless subjects to study. She began collecting caterpillars and carefully observing how they changed over time. Unlike many of her peers, Maria did not fear these creatures. Instead, she placed them in boxes, feeding them leaves and recording what she saw. Slowly, she began to understand the mystery of metamorphosis, the way a crawling caterpillar could transform into a cocoon and eventually emerge as a butterfly or moth. This was knowledge not widely understood in her time, when many people believed insects were born from mud or decay. Maria translated her observations into drawings, using her developing artistic skill to record each stage of insect life with accuracy. These drawings were not just childlike sketches. They reflected a serious curiosity and discipline unusual for her age. The union of art and science was already visible in her earliest works, as she paid attention to details of wings, leaves, and blossoms with equal care. This childhood fascination with insects marked the beginning of a lifelong journey. What started as a girl's hobby in the gardens of Frankfurt would one day evolve into groundbreaking studies that challenged traditional beliefs and transformed how the world viewed nature. Maria Sibylla Merian's artistic talents were nurtured within her own household, where her stepfather, Jacob Marrel, played a central role. Marrel was a skilled still-life painter, especially known for his floral compositions, and he recognized Maria's potential at a young age. Under his guidance, she was introduced to the fundamentals of drawing, painting, and the disciplined study of form and color. Unlike many girls of her time who were encouraged toward domestic skills, Maria was allowed to develop her artistic ability in a professional environment. Training in Marrel's studio exposed her to the Dutch and German traditions of botanical illustration, where accuracy and elegance were equally prized. She learned how to use watercolors to capture the delicate textures of petals and leaves, and how to arrange natural subjects in a way that combined scientific detail with artistic beauty. This foundation would later prove invaluable when she began illustrating insects alongside the plants they depended on for food. Marrel also encouraged her to study nature directly rather than relying solely on copies or imagination. This meant Maria spent long hours sketching from life, carefully noting how flowers unfolded and how insects moved across them. While her artistic peers focused only on beauty, Maria sought to capture truth. Her sketches often included subtle imperfections in plants or the precise curve of an insect's wing, signaling her lifelong interest in accuracy. This period of training under Jacob Marrel shaped Maria into more than just a painter. It prepared her to become an observer of life itself. By uniting careful technique with curiosity, she was laying the groundwork for her future as both artist and naturalist. In 1665, Maria Sibylla Merian married Johann Andreas Graf, a painter and engraver who had trained in the same artistic circles as her stepfather, Jacob Marrel. Their union marked a new chapter in Maria's life as she moved with Graf to Nuremberg, one of the vibrant cultural centers of the German lands. Nuremberg offered opportunities for artists, publishers, and scholars, and Maria soon became part of this thriving community. Marriage brought both challenges and openings. As a wife, Maria was expected to fulfill traditional household duties, yet she managed to carve out time for her art and scientific interests. With Graf's connections, she gained access to artistic workshops and printing houses, which allowed her to publish and distribute her early works. These connections helped her reputation grow beyond her immediate circle. In Nuremberg, Maria also began to teach other young women painting and embroidery, passing on her skills in depicting flowers, insects, and natural subjects. This not only provided her with income, but also reinforced her role as both artist and educator. While Graf focused largely on architectural illustrations, Maria's attention remained fixed on the natural world, especially insects. Despite the partnership, their marriage was not always harmonious. Maria's deep scientific interests and independent spirit sometimes clashed with conventional expectations. Still, it was during her years in Nuremberg that she laid the foundation for her first publications, blending her artistry with careful natural observation. The city became both a stage for her growing reputation and a setting where her unique vision began to take shape. By the late 1660s and early 1670s, Maria Sibylla Merian began to make her mark as both an artist and naturalist. Living in Nuremberg, she worked steadily on her first major publication, Nieuws Bloemenbuch, or New Book of Flowers. Published in parts between 1675 and 1680, this work displayed her skill in floral illustration and served as a teaching guide for embroidery and decorative painting. The book quickly gained popularity among women who wished to learn artistic techniques while also appreciating the beauty of the natural world. Yet Maria's ambition reached beyond decorative art. She was fascinated by the transformation of insects and wanted to reveal their hidden lives through careful observation. In 1679, she published Der Ropen Wunderbar Verwandlung und Sonderbar Blumenarung, translated as the wonderful transformation of caterpillars and their remarkable diet of flowers. This groundbreaking work combined accurate illustrations of insects with detailed notes on their life cycles and the plants they depended upon. Unlike earlier natural histories that often copied from others, Maria's studies came directly from her own meticulous observations. The books were unusual for their time, uniting scientific accuracy with artistic elegance. They attracted attention not only among artists, but also among scholars and collectors of natural history. These early publications marked the beginning of her reputation as someone who straddled two worlds, the precision of science and the creativity of art. With these works, Maria established herself as a pioneer whose vision would inspire curiosity and admiration across Europe. By the early 1680s, Maria Sibylla Merian's marriage to Johann Andreas Graf was showing strain. Though both shared artistic training, their lives diverged. Graf's career in Nuremberg had limited success, and Maria's growing recognition as a naturalist and illustrator began to overshadow his work. The tension between them increased as Maria's interests moved deeper into the study of insects and their life cycles, which required patience, solitude, and independence. In 1685, Maria made a decisive change. She returned with her two daughters to her native Frankfurt, leaving Graf behind in Nuremberg. This separation was unusual for a woman of her time, as marriages were expected to endure despite personal or professional conflict. Yet Maria's choice reflected her determination to follow her own path. She rejoined her mother and sought stability while continuing her studies. During this period, she worked on expanding her earlier publications and preparing for new editions. Frankfurt provided access to intellectual circles and a lively book trade, which suited her ambitions. The move also marked the first time Maria stepped away from the traditional roles of wife and dependent woman, asserting her identity as an independent thinker and provider for her children. Although she and Graf never formally divorced, their lives remained separate from this point onward. For Maria, the move to Frankfurt signaled both personal sacrifice and newfound freedom. It was a bold step that allowed her to grow further as a scientist and artist, laying the foundation for the extraordinary achievements that would follow. In 1685, after leaving her husband behind in Nuremberg, Maria Sibylla Merian made a surprising decision. She took her two daughters and traveled north to join the Labadist religious community in Friesland, located at Wieruwerd. The Labadists, followers of Jean de Labadie, were known for their strict spiritual way of life, emphasizing simplicity, communal living, and devotion to God. For Maria, who had grown weary of worldly distractions and marital discord, the move offered both refuge and purpose. Life in Wieruwerd was far different from the bustling cities she had known. The Labadists encouraged their members to give up personal property, to live modestly, and to dedicate themselves to faith. Maria adapted to this environment while continuing to observe nature in the surrounding countryside. Despite the community's austere rules, she found opportunities to study plants and insects, quietly maintaining her scientific curiosity. The stay in Friesland also shaped her daughter's upbringing, instilling discipline and a sense of independence. However, the Labadist lifestyle proved difficult in the long term. Maria's artistic and intellectual ambitions did not fully align with the community's focus on withdrawal from worldly affairs. After several years, she realized she could not suppress her need to create and to share her discoveries with a wider audience. By the early 1690s, Maria chose to leave the Labadists behind. Though her time there was temporary, the experience deepened her sense of discipline, strengthened her faith, and prepared her for the independence she would later claim in Amsterdam. It was a turning point, shaping her inner resolve for the extraordinary journey that lay ahead. By the early 1690s, Maria Sibylla Merian settled in Amsterdam, a city that offered her both freedom and opportunity. Amsterdam was then one of Europe's most vibrant centers of trade, science, and art, attracting merchants, explorers, and scholars from across the world. Here, Maria was no longer constrained by the rules of the Labadist community or the difficulties of her marriage. Instead, she was able to live as an independent woman, supporting herself and her daughters through her art and natural history studies. Amsterdam's bustling markets exposed her to exotic specimens brought from overseas colonies, shells, plants, insects, and even living animals. This access fueled her curiosity and expanded her knowledge beyond the European landscapes she had previously studied. She became acquainted with prominent scientists, collectors, and naturalists who admired her precise illustrations and encouraged her research. Maria also began selling her artworks, teaching and publishing, which allowed her to build a stable livelihood. Unlike many women of her time, she chose not to depend on a husband or a religious community. Her independence was remarkable, as few women in the late 17th century were able to sustain themselves through intellectual and artistic work. In Amsterdam, Maria's reputation grew steadily. Her network of supporters expanded, and she gained recognition not only as an artist, but also as a serious naturalist. This period marked a powerful shift. She had transformed personal hardship into resilience, carving a path that combined her passion for art with groundbreaking scientific observation. It was in Amsterdam that she began to plan the boldest project of her life, the expedition to Suriname. By the close of the 17th century, Maria Sibylla Merian had built a reputation in Amsterdam as both an accomplished artist and a respected naturalist. Yet her ambitions reached far beyond Europe's borders. She was captivated by the idea of studying insects and plants in their natural tropical environments, where far greater diversity existed than in the temperate gardens of Germany or the Netherlands. Inspired by specimens brought from overseas colonies, she envisioned a first-hand study that would surpass anything previously attempted by a woman of her time. Suriname, a Dutch colony in South America, became her chosen destination. Unlike many naturalists who relied on second-hand reports and imported samples, Maria resolved to see the flora and fauna in their native surroundings. She recognized that only through direct observation could she document the life cycles of insects and the interdependence of species with precision and accuracy. This decision reflected both her scientific ambition and her remarkable independence, as such journeys were typically reserved for men supported by universities or royal patrons. Her planning was meticulous. She began gathering funds by selling her artwork and teaching students, while also cultivating networks among wealthy patrons and collectors who valued exotic discoveries. Maria's daughters, who were trained in painting and research, prepared to accompany and assist her. The Suriname expedition was more than a personal dream. It represented a groundbreaking scientific mission. Maria intended not just to paint beautiful images, but to expand the world's understanding of natural history. With determination and careful preparation, she set her sights on an extraordinary journey that would become the defining chapter of her life. In the year 1699, Maria Sibylla Merian embarked on her daring expedition to Suriname, accompanied by her daughter Dorothea. The journey itself was a feat of courage. Transatlantic voyages at the time were long, dangerous, and unpredictable, with cramped living conditions, harsh weather, and the constant risk of disease. Yet Maria pressed forward, driven by the vision of documenting the plants and insects of the tropics firsthand. When they finally reached Suriname, she encountered an environment both breathtaking and overwhelming. The lush forests were filled with countless species, many of which were unknown in Europe. However, the beauty of the colony was matched by its challenges. The tropical heat was stifling, insects carried illnesses, and wild terrain made travel exhausting. Supplies were often scarce, and Maria had to rely on local knowledge to find and preserve specimens. Despite these obstacles, she approached her work with remarkable determination. She ventured into plantations, riverbanks, and jungles, observing butterflies, moths, and other insects as they developed from eggs to caterpillars, pupae, and adults. The vivid tropical plants that served as hosts for these creatures became part of her detailed studies. She also noted the relationships between species, recognizing ecological connections that few scientists of her era understood. The expedition tested her endurance daily, but it also offered her the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. For Maria, every hardship was outweighed by the chance to capture the living patterns of nature in their authentic setting, an achievement unprecedented for a European woman of her time. In Suriname, Maria Sibylla Merian immersed herself in the vibrant natural world that had inspired her daring voyage. With sketchbook and brushes always at hand, she documented the astonishing variety of insects and plants that surrounded her. Unlike collectors who gathered specimens and shipped them back to Europe, Maria insisted on observing each creature alive, in its natural environment. She carefully traced the transformations of caterpillars into butterflies and moths, capturing every stage of metamorphosis in meticulous detail. Her drawings were more than artistic impressions. They were scientific records that paired insects with the plants that sustained them. She illustrated caterpillars feeding on specific leaves, pupae clinging to branches, and fully developed butterflies spreading their wings in vibrant display. This ecological perspective was revolutionary, showing interconnections between species rather than isolating them. Maria's images revealed the delicate balance of life in the tropics, a vision far ahead of its time. She also studied exotic plants with equal care. From towering palms to delicate blossoms, she painted the flora with precision, often noting their uses by indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Her work offered Europeans a rare window into the botanical richness of South America, blending scientific insight with cultural observation. The challenges of heat, illness, and scarcity did not deter her. Instead, they deepened her resolve. Each page of her sketches testified to her endurance and her belief in the importance of direct observation. By combining artistry with scientific rigor, Maria laid the groundwork for one of the most significant natural history books of her era. After 2 years in Suriname, Maria Sibylla Merian's health began to suffer under the relentless tropical conditions. Weak from illness, but carrying a treasure of sketches, notes, and preserved specimens, she made the difficult decision to return to Amsterdam in 1701. Though her body had endured the toll of fevers and fatigue, her mind was ablaze with the vision of transforming her fieldwork into a monumental publication. Settled once more in Amsterdam, Maria set about preparing her most celebrated masterpiece, Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium. This book, published in 1705, combined her detailed engravings with descriptions of the insects and plants she had studied in Suriname. Each plate paired exquisite artistry with scientific accuracy, presenting the life cycles of butterflies, moths, beetles, and other insects in vivid color. Alongside the creatures appeared their host plants, demonstrating the ecological connections that fascinated her. Her publication was revolutionary. While other naturalists often relied on second-hand accounts or preserved specimens, Maria's work was grounded in direct observation in the field. This gave her illustrations a vibrancy and truth unmatched by her contemporaries. The book immediately drew attention across Europe, praised for its beauty as well as its scientific importance. However, the project was also financially burdensome. The cost of engraving and printing colored plates was immense, forcing Maria to sell some of her original paintings to cover expenses. Despite these struggles, her determination ensured that the metamorphosis reached an audience far beyond Amsterdam, securing her reputation as both an artist and a pioneering naturalist. Sibylla Merian's influence extended far beyond her lifetime, reshaping the way natural history was studied and recorded. Her approach combined rigorous observation with artistic mastery, creating a model for scientific illustration that inspired generations. At a time when many European naturalists relied on preserved specimens, Maria insisted on watching insects live, feed, and transform. This methodology not only made her illustrations more accurate, but also established a new standard for documenting ecological relationships. Her Metamorphosis Insectorum Surinamensium became a reference work for naturalists across Europe. Scientists like Carl Linnaeus, who later developed the modern system of biological classification, drew heavily on her observations. He cited her work when naming and describing numerous insect species, recognizing the reliability of her records. Through this, her contributions entered the very foundation of taxonomy and entomology. Equally important was her legacy as one of the first women to achieve international recognition in science. In an era when female participation in scholarly pursuits was often dismissed, Maria carved out space through her determination, skill, and independence. She demonstrated that women could contribute meaningfully to the advancement of knowledge, inspiring others to pursue paths in science and art despite societal barriers. Her blend of aesthetics and precision influenced not only entomologists, but also botanical artists and illustrators for centuries. By showing the interconnectedness of insects and plants, she helped shift natural history toward a more ecological perspective. Maria's work proved that beauty and knowledge could coexist on the same page, leaving an enduring mark on both science and art. The reception of Sibylla Merian's work was remarkable, though not without its critics. During her lifetime, her books were admired for their artistic elegance and scientific precision, attracting wealthy patrons, collectors, and scholars across Europe. Yet some contemporaries questioned the credibility of a woman publishing scientific observations, reflecting the gender biases of her age. Still, her reputation steadily grew, proving that her contributions could not be dismissed. In the 18th and 19th centuries, her engravings and notes were reprinted and circulated widely, ensuring her work remained influential long after her passing. Linnaeus and other naturalists leaned on her findings to classify new species, while collectors prized her paintings for their beauty. However, a few scholars criticized her reliance on artistic embellishment, overlooking how she was among the first to emphasize the relationship between insects and their host plants. Modern historians and scientists now view her as a trailblazer. She is celebrated not only as a pioneer of entomology, but also as one of the earliest ecologists, highlighting interdependence in nature centuries before the term ecology existed. Art historians recognize her ability to fuse scientific clarity with visual grace, bridging two disciplines that often seemed separate. Today, her legacy endures in museums, scientific institutions, and art collections worldwide. Streets, schools, and even species bear her name, honoring a woman who defied convention to bring the natural world to life. Sibylla Merian's story stands as a reminder that innovation often comes from those bold enough to cross boundaries. In her later years, Sibylla Merian continued her work in Amsterdam despite declining health. The Suriname expedition had weakened her body, leaving her with recurring illness and less strength. Still, she stayed devoted to her studies, working on collections, guiding her daughters, and preparing illustrations that reinforced her life's achievements. Amsterdam's intellectual climate gave her support and recognition, as scholars and patrons admired her unique contributions. By the early 1700s, however, her health worsened. Financial struggles added to her burdens, since the cost of printing often outweighed her income. Yet her reputation as both artist and scientist grew, with her books purchased and admired across Europe. Sibylla Merian passed away in Amsterdam on the 13th of January in the year 1717, at the age of 69. Though she died with modest means, her work lived on through her daughters, who preserved and shared her drawings and plates. After her death, her publications gained renewed attention. Naturalists like Linnaeus cited her observations, while art historians praised her mastery of detail and color. In later centuries, she was celebrated as a pioneer who bridged art and science. Today, her name endures as a symbol of curiosity, perseverance, and originality, securing her place in history as one of the most influential figures in natural science and illustration. What do you think about Margaret Cavendish of England? Was Margaret a daring visionary, a writer of boundless imagination who broke barriers in science, philosophy, and literature, leaving her mark as one of the most original voices of the 17th century? Or was she a restless dreamer, dismissed in her own time as eccentric, her bold ideas overlooked by a world unwilling to accept a woman's authority in intellectual debate? And what about Sibylla Merian of Germany? Was Maria a trailblazing naturalist, a woman of courage who journeyed across oceans to study the wonders of Suriname, combining art and science in ways that reshaped how we see nature? Or was she a quiet struggler, weighed down by illness and financial strain, her brilliance nearly forgotten until history finally recognized her contribution? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these women misunderstood voices in a world of men, or radiant lights whose persistence carved paths for future generations? Did their strength shape history, or was it history that tried to silence them? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past. Stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.